An 8-year-old girl stood barefoot on a freezing porch as her drunken mother called her worthless and threw her out like trash. The whole street watched and did nothing, except one quiet millionaire who happened to pass by that morning. What he chose to do next would change both their lives forever. Dawn arrived slowly in Briar Glen, Vermont, the way it always did in early autumn, quiet, reluctant, wrapped in a thin silver mist that clung to the sleepy streets. The maple trees along Hawthorne Street had begun their slow transformation, their leaves burning in shades of amber and copper that drifted gently across sidewalks still wet from the night's dew. It was the kind of peaceful morning most people in town cherished, the kind that promised calm routines and warm coffee. But on the cracked porch of a fading blue house halfway down the street, peace did not exist. 8-year-old Ilara Quinn stood barefoot on the cold wooden boards, her thin shoulders swallowed by an oversized gray t-shirt that reached nearly to her knees. In front of her were 3 swollen black trash bags, each nearly as tall as she was. She struggled to drag the first one toward the steps, her small fingers tightening against the plastic, as if the bag itself might escape. Inside the house, something crashed. Glass shattered. Then came the voice. "Move faster, you useless mistake!" The front door burst open. Marina Quinn, her hair tangled and her eyes wild with alcohol and rage, staggered onto the porch, holding a half-empty bottle. Without warning, she shoved Ilara hard in the shoulder. The girl stumbled, catching herself on the railing just before falling down the steps. Across the street, a man watering his lawn froze. Another neighbor looked up from his mailbox. Neither moved. Ilara bent down immediately and picked up the trash bag again, as if this were simply the rhythm of her life. At that exact moment, Silas Vale turned the corner on his morning walk. The quiet millionaire of Briar Glen slowed without meaning to, because just as he reached the sidewalk in front of the house, Marina swung her hand and slapped the little girl across the face. The sound cracked through the cold morning air like breaking ice, and suddenly, the peaceful street didn't feel peaceful at all. For a moment, Silas Vale forgot how to move. The sharp sound of that slap still echoed in the air as the autumn wind stirred dry leaves across the pavement at his feet. Normally, Silas walked through Briar Glen without truly seeing it. His morning route was a shield, a carefully constructed routine meant to keep the past quiet. Same streets, same time, same steady rhythm of footsteps that required no thinking, no feeling. But the moment his eyes met the girl's, that rhythm shattered. She couldn't have been older than 8. Her cheek had already begun to flush red where the blow had landed, yet she didn't cry. Instead, she lowered her head and resumed dragging the heavy trash bag down the steps as if pain were simply another task on a long list she had already accepted. That was the part that unsettled him the most. Children cried, children protested, children ran to someone for help. This child did none of those things. Across the street, the man with the garden hose slowly turned his back toward the scene, letting the water spill across his lawn as if nothing unusual had happened. A passing sedan slowed for a moment, the driver glancing at the porch before pressing the gas again and disappearing around the corner. The entire street had silently agreed to pretend they had seen nothing. Silas knew that instinct well. For nearly a decade, he had built his life around the same quiet agreement with the world. Do not look too closely at suffering you cannot fix. At 47, Silas was known throughout Briar Glen as the reclusive millionaire on the ridge. Years earlier, he had built a small technology company from his garage and sold it for more money than most people in town would see in a lifetime. Then, almost overnight, he vanished from public life. The truth was simple. His wife had died in a car accident. She had been 7 months pregnant with their daughter. After that day, Silas learned that loving someone deeply meant gambling with devastation. So he stopped gambling. Routine was safer. Distance was safer. Feeling nothing at all was safest of all. He took 2 steps forward, telling himself to keep walking. Families argued sometimes, Parents yelled. It wasn't his place. But just as he reached the end of the driveway, the girl glanced up at him. Her eyes were an impossible shade of pale blue, and in them Silas saw something he recognized instantly. Not sadness, not even fear. Resignation. That afternoon, Silas Vale told himself the morning had been nothing more than an unpleasant moment. Something unfortunate. Something ugly. Something that had nothing to do with him. But when his truck reached Hawthorne Street on the way back from town, his foot eased off the accelerator before he even realized why. The blue house was still there, peeling paint, curling along the window frames like tired skin. And on the small patch of yard in front of it, the little girl was working again. She stood ankle-deep in a pile of wet maple leaves, dragging a crooked metal rake across the ground with slow, careful movements. The oversized gray shirt still hung from her shoulders, and the morning chill had sharpened into a colder afternoon wind that brushed through the thinning trees. Silas pulled his truck quietly to the curb. For a moment, he simply watched through the windshield. The girl moved quickly, methodically, like someone completing chores under the pressure of invisible consequences. When she lifted the rake again, her sleeve slid up her thin arm, revealing a fading bruise circling her wrist. Silas felt something tighten uncomfortably inside his chest. He stepped out of the truck before he could talk himself out of it. The crunch of gravel under his shoes made the girl stiffen instantly. She turned toward the house, eyes flicking to the front window, as if checking whether someone inside might be watching. Silas stopped several feet away, careful not to approach too fast. "Hey there," he said gently. "Shouldn't you be in school today?" The girl froze. Her fingers tightened around the rake handle. For a moment she looked like a small animal deciding whether to run. Then her face shifted into something carefully neutral. "I'm fine, sir," she said quickly. "My mom is sick today. I stayed home to help." The answer came too smoothly, too rehearsed. Silas noticed the way she tugged her sleeve back down over the bruise. He also noticed something else, the faint tremble in her voice. "Well," he said quietly, glancing toward the worn farmhouse on the distant ridge above town, "I live up there. If you ever need anything, that's where to find me." The girl blinked. The idea seemed to confuse her. Kindness often does when you've lived too long without it. "Okay," she said softly. Silas nodded and stepped back toward his truck. As he drove away, he heard her voice behind him, so quiet he almost missed it. "Thank you, sir." But something in the way the words trembled told him a truth she hadn't said out loud. She wasn't okay, and deep down, Silas already knew it. That night, sleep refused to come. Silas Vale lay in the quiet darkness of his farmhouse bedroom, staring at the ceiling as the wind moved softly through the trees outside. The house had always been silent, comfortably silent. For years he had treated that silence like a shield against the world. No arguments, no laughter, no memories waiting in the hallway. Just peace. But tonight, the quiet felt wrong. He rose from bed and walked to the wide window overlooking the town below. Briar Glens spread across the valley like a scatter of warm lights, each house glowing gently against the deep blue of the autumn night. Most windows had already gone dark, families settling into dinner, television, homework, ordinary lives. Except one. Halfway down Hawthorne Street, a single square of yellow light still burned through thin curtains. Alara Quinn's bedroom. Silas leaned a hand against the cool glass, watching. Midnight passed. The light did not turn off. At one point, a shadow crossed the window quickly, small, quick, nervous. Then the room went still again. Something about that simple detail unsettled him deeply. 8-year-olds did not stay awake this late unless something inside their world refused to let them rest. He tried to tell himself he was imagining things. Maybe she just had trouble sleeping. Maybe she liked reading late. Maybe her mother had already calmed down after the morning's outburst. Maybe. But deep down, Silas knew those thoughts were lies designed to make walking away easier. The image of her small bare feet on that freezing porch returned to him again and again. The bruise around her wrist, the way she had lied automatically. And worst of all, the way she had not cried. Silas exhaled slowly. For nearly 10 years he had built a life around one simple rule: stay out of problems that could pull you back into pain. Yet as he stared at that lonely yellow window glowing against the dark town below, he felt the uncomfortable truth settling quietly inside his chest. This time walking away might cost him something he could never get back. Over the next few days, Silas told himself he was only passing Hawthorne Street by coincidence. The first time he was simply returning from the grocery store. The second time he had taken a slightly different running route. The third time he stopped pretending. Patterns had always been Silas Vale's specialty. It was how he built his company years ago, by noticing connections others ignored. And now he was seeing patterns again. None of them were good. One gray afternoon, he spotted Alara Quinn walking half a step behind her mother outside the local grocery market. The girl struggled to carry 2 heavy paper bags, while Marina Quinn staggered ahead, laughing loudly, her arm wrapped possessively around a brown paper bag that clearly held a bottle. The child was the one doing the work. Another morning, he saw Alara standing at the bus stop, wearing the same thin shirt despite the cold, her arms wrapped tightly around herself as frost clung to the grass. Later that week, he noticed the smallest detail of all. A car door slammed in the parking lot of the town pharmacy. Alara flinched violently. Not dramatically, not loudly. Just a quick, instinctive tightening of her shoulders, the kind that comes from living too long with sudden violence. The moment that finally erased any remaining doubt came inside the grocery store. Silas stood behind Alara in the checkout line when something slipped from her worn purple backpack and fluttered to the floor. He bent down to pick it up. It was a drawing, crayons on thin paper. In the picture, a tiny girl curled into a corner while a towering red figure stood above her, holding a jagged bottle. Silas felt the air leave his lungs. Alara saw the paper in his hands and froze, her face drained of color. "Please," she whispered urgently, snatching the drawing back. "Don't show my mom." Silas watched her shove the paper into her bag with trembling fingers. She tried to smile, but her hands would not stop shaking. 2 days later, Silas Vale found himself walking through the front doors of Briar Glen Elementary School. He had not planned it. At least that was what he told himself. The building smelled faintly of floor polish, paper, and cafeteria food, the familiar scent of childhood places where life was supposed to be simple. Children's drawings covered the hallway walls, bright colors, and smiling stick figures that seemed painfully distant from the image burned into Silas's mind. At the front desk sat Mrs. Evelyn Hart, the school's longtime secretary. She recognized him immediately. "Mr. Vale," she said, politely, surprised. "What brings you here?" Silas hesitated before answering. "I was wondering about tutoring programs," he said carefully. "For a student who might be struggling." Mrs. Hart studied his face for a moment. Then she leaned slightly closer and lowered her voice. "Is this about Alara Quinn?" Silas didn't answer. He didn't need to. Mrs. Hart sighed quietly, the sound of someone who had been carrying a difficult truth for too long. "She's missed 23 days this semester," she said, pulling up a file on her computer. "Teachers have reported bruises before. Hunger, too. She falls asleep in class sometimes." Silas felt his stomach tighten. "Has anyone done anything?" Mrs. Hart's expression softened with something close to guilt. "Social services came once last year," she said. "But the case stalled. Not enough evidence. Her mother always has an explanation." Outside the office window, children ran across the playground, their laughter drifting through the crisp afternoon air. Mrs. Hart looked back at Silas. "Everyone in town knows something isn't right in that house," she admitted quietly. Then she added the sentence that would follow Silas long after he left the school. But knowing and proving are two very different things. Silas stepped outside into the cool autumn air. For the first time since seeing that little girl on the porch, the problem no longer felt distant. It felt inevitable. And deep down, he already understood something important. Sooner or later, someone was going to have to stop pretending. The storm arrived suddenly over Briar Glen. By late evening, the sky had turned the color of bruised steel, and cold rain swept across the town in slanted sheets that rattled against windows and rooftops. Wind tore loose the last stubborn leaves from the maple trees, sending them spiraling through the dark streets like restless spirits. Inside his farmhouse on the ridge, Silas Vale stood near the tall window overlooking the valley. Thunder rolled somewhere beyond the hills. Normally, storms comforted him. The noise filled the empty rooms of the house and made solitude feel less absolute. Tonight, it only sharpened the unease that had been growing inside him for days. His eyes drifted automatically toward Hawthorne Street, toward the peeling blue house. A flash of lightning lit the town below. And that was when he saw her. The front door burst open. A small figure shot out into the rain, Ilara Quinn. She was barefoot again, clutching a black trash bag against her chest, as if it were armor. Rain instantly soaked through her thin shirt as she ran across the yard, her small shoulders hunched against the wind. For a moment, she stopped near the curb. Silas could see her clearly now through the glass. She looked down the empty street in both directions, like someone searching for somewhere safe. But the town was dark. No porch lights turned on, no doors opened. Another flash of lightning split the sky. Behind her, the door of the house slammed open again. A shadow appeared in the doorway. Even from this distance, Silas could feel the tension snap tight inside his chest. Ilara froze. For one fragile moment, it looked like she might run. Really run. But instead, she slowly turned around and walked back toward the house, the rain streaming down her hair and face, as if the storm itself were trying to wash something away. The door closed behind her, and the street returned to silence. Silas remained at the window long after the lightning faded, his hands pressed against the cold glass, because now he understood something with terrible clarity. That little girl hadn't stepped outside to escape the rain. She had stepped outside to escape the house, and she had nowhere else in the world to go. The storm had weakened by the next afternoon, leaving Briar Glen damp and gray beneath low clouds. Silas stopped at the small corner store on Oak Avenue, hoping a simple errand might quiet the thoughts that had followed him all morning. The place smelled faintly of coffee dust and wet pavement tracked in by customers escaping the weather. He had barely stepped inside when he heard a small voice at the counter. "I think I have enough." Silas turned. Standing on tiptoe in front of the register was Ilara Quinn. Her thin fingers carefully pushed a handful of coins toward the cashier. Next to the register sat a loaf of bread and a small carton of milk, the inexpensive kind sold for school lunches. The cashier, an older man with tired eyes, counted the coins slowly. Then he shook his head gently. "Sweetheart, you're still short." Ilara swallowed and quickly began counting the coins again, her lips moving silently, as if she could somehow make the numbers change. Before she could answer, the front door of the store burst open. Cold wind rushed inside, and with it came Marina Quinn. Her hair was tangled from the storm, and she clutched a bottle hidden halfway inside a brown paper bag. Even from across the room, the smell of alcohol was unmistakable. "What are you doing?" she barked. Ilara stiffened instantly. "They didn't have the vodka you like," the girl said softly. "So I got milk," and the slap came fast, not loud, but sharp enough that every person in the store heard it. Ilara stumbled sideways into the counter. Marina snatched the bread and tossed it back toward the cashier. "We don't need this," she snapped. "And she doesn't need to eat." The girl's eyes filled with tears. She desperately tried to hold back. "Please," Ilara whispered. "Mom, please don't make me go home. I'll be good." The words hung in the air like something fragile. Around the store, people looked down. No one spoke. No one moved. But near the aisle of canned soup, Silas Vale's hands slowly curled into fists. Because for the second time in less than a week, the whole town was watching a child break. Marina Quinn grabbed Alara's arm roughly and yanked her toward the door. "You think anyone wants you?" she hissed. "You're mine. You go where I say." The milk carton slipped from Alara's shaking hands and burst open on the floor, white liquid spreading across the tiles like spilled paint. She tried to catch herself, but her foot slid. The little girl fell hard onto her knees. A quiet whimper escaped her before she could stop it. For a moment, Marina simply stared down at her. Then she tightened her grip on Alara's arm and jerked her upright again. "Get up," she snapped. That was when Silas Vale stepped forward. He moved calmly across the store and stopped directly in front of the door, blocking it. Marina blinked, surprised. "Move," she said sharply. Silas didn't move. His voice when he spoke was quiet. "Steady. That's enough." The entire store went still. Marina let out a short laugh. "Mind your own business, buddy." Silas met her eyes without raising his voice. "I tried to." He glanced briefly at Alara, who was still trembling beside her mother. "But she's a child." For a second, Marina looked stunned. Then her expression twisted with anger. "You think you're some kind of hero," she snapped. "She's my daughter. I can take her wherever I want." Behind the counter, the cashier slowly reached for the phone. Silas remained exactly where he stood. "I know what I saw," he said quietly. "And you're not taking her out of here like this." Marina's grip on Alara tightened painfully. The girl's eyes flickered toward Silas, not with expectation, not with confidence, but with something fragile that looked almost like hope. Outside, distant sirens began to echo through the damp streets of Briar Glen. Marina heard them too. Her face darkened. "You'll regret this," she spat. But Silas didn't answer. He was already kneeling beside Alara, helping her carefully to her feet. "You're okay," he murmured gently. And for the first time since he had met her, the little girl didn't let go of his sleeve. The back room of the corner store was small, narrow, and painfully bright, beneath buzzing fluorescent lights. A plastic chair scraped softly across the floor as Alara Quinn sat down, her thin legs barely reaching the edge of the seat. Someone had given her a paper cup filled with hot chocolate from the vending machine near the break room door. She held it with both hands, as if the warmth might disappear if she let go. Across from her sat Silas Vale. For the first time since the confrontation in the store, the adrenaline was beginning to drain from his body. The quiet left behind felt strange, fragile, like the silence that followed a thunderstorm. Alara stared at the cup for a long moment, before taking a cautious sip. The warmth touched her lips, and something inside her shoulders relaxed slightly. Neither of them spoke at first. Outside the door, muffled voices drifted through the hallway as Deputy Tom Keller gathered statements from witnesses and tried to calm the furious shouting of Marina Quinn somewhere near the patrol car. Alara's eyes flickered nervously toward the sound. "She just gets mad sometimes," the girl whispered suddenly. Silas looked up. "It's my fault usually," she continued quietly. "I forget things. Or I break something." Her words came out quickly, like a rehearsed explanation she had repeated many times before. Silas felt something twist painfully inside his chest. "That's not your fault," he said gently. Alara didn't answer. Instead, she raised the cup again, hiding half her face behind it. For a moment, the room went silent. Then she lowered the cup and studied him carefully, her pale blue eyes filled with cautious curiosity. "Why do you have a big house for just one person?" she asked. The question landed harder than anything else that had happened that day. Silas exhaled slowly. "I didn't always live there alone," he said. Alara waited patiently. Silas swallowed. My wife died a long time ago, he continued quietly. She was pregnant with our daughter. The girl's fingers tightened around the paper cup. I'm sorry, she whispered. Silas nodded once. For years he had learned how to speak about that loss without feeling it too deeply. But sitting across from this small, exhausted child, the words suddenly felt heavier than usual. I couldn't save them, he admitted. Ilara was silent for a moment. Then she set the cup carefully on the table and leaned forward slightly. Her voice was almost too soft to hear. Maybe you could practice on me. Silas blinked. What do you mean? He asked gently. Ilara shrugged a little, staring at the table. Practice saving someone. For the first time in years, Silas Vale had absolutely no idea what to say. A quiet knock came at the break room door. When it opened, a woman stepped inside carrying a clipboard and a calm expression shaped by years of difficult work. Carmen Reyes, Child Protective Services. She knelt beside Ilara, immediately lowering herself so they were eye level. Hi, sweetheart, she said softly. My name is Carmen. Ilara's fingers instinctively reached for the sleeve of Silas's jacket. Not tightly. Just enough to feel that someone was still there. Carmen noticed the gesture but didn't comment on it. Instead, she began asking gentle questions. What's your name, Ilara? And how old are you? 8? Do you feel safe going home tonight? The girl hesitated. Her eyes moved slowly toward Silas, then back to the floor. A small shake of her head. Carmen nodded quietly and stood up. She motioned for Silas to step into the hallway. Based on what we saw today, she explained carefully, she won't be going home tonight. Silas felt a small surge of relief. That's good, he said. Carmen hesitated. She'll go into emergency foster placement, she continued. Probably tonight. Silas frowned slightly. Probably Carmen sighed. The system's overloaded, she admitted. Sometimes kids have to move between temporary homes before we find something stable. Silas glanced through the doorway. Inside the break room, Ilara sat alone again, her feet swinging slightly above the floor as she stared at the cup of hot chocolate. She looked so small, so tired. So she might go to strangers, he said quietly. Yes. And then maybe more strangers after that. Carmen gave a small nod. Silas ran a hand slowly through his hair. For years he had lived comfortably within the boundaries of his own carefully controlled life. But watching Ilara sitting there, waiting silently to be sent somewhere else, somewhere unknown, felt unbearably wrong. Inside the break room, the little girl leaned forward and rested her head on her folded arms. Her eyes closed. A few seconds later, she murmured something softly in her sleep. Carmen glanced toward the door. What did she say? Silas asked. Carmen listened carefully. Then her expression shifted. She said, Please don't send me to another stranger. Silas felt those words settle heavily in his chest. For the first time that day, a thought began forming in his mind. A thought that would change everything. Silas stood in the hallway for several long seconds. Rain tapped softly against the windows of the store, while the distant murmur of police radios drifted through the building. Carmen Reyes finished writing something on her clipboard. You did a good thing today, she told him gently. Most people would have walked away. Silas didn't answer immediately. Through the open doorway, he could still see Ilara asleep at the table. Her small hands were wrapped around the paper cup, as if she were afraid someone might take even that small comfort away. What happens next? Silas asked quietly. Carmen shrugged slightly. She'll go to an emergency placement tonight, she explained. Then we'll start the process of evaluating longer-term foster homes. Silas nodded slowly. How long does that usually take? Sometimes weeks, Carmen admitted. Sometimes months. Silas exhaled. Months. Months of unfamiliar houses, unfamiliar adults, new rooms, new rules, new fear. He looked at Ilara again. Her shoulders twitched slightly in her sleep. "Is there another option?" he asked. Carmen raised an eyebrow. What kind of option? Silas hesitated. Not because he didn't know the answer, because saying it out loud meant crossing a line he had spent years avoiding. "What if—" he began slowly. "What if I applied to take her?" Carmen blinked. "You mean temporary guardianship?" Silas nodded. "I have the space," he said. "The house, the resources. I can hire help if needed." Carmen studied him carefully. "Mr. Vale," she said cautiously, "this is a serious commitment. Foster care involves background checks, court hearings, inspections, I understand. And your life will become very public very quickly. I'm used to that, and the mother will fight you." Silas glanced again at the sleeping girl. For years he had convinced himself that staying emotionally distant was the only safe way to live. But watching Ilara cling to that paper cup like it was the only warmth left in her world, he realized something. Distance had never truly protected him. It had only kept him from helping anyone. "I lost my family once," Silas said quietly. "I won't stand by and watch another child lose hers if I can do something about it." Carmen remained silent for a moment. Then she slowly closed the clipboard. "Well," she said softly, "in that case, we should probably start the paperwork tonight." The courthouse in Briar Glen had stood at the center of town for more than 100 years, its old brick walls carrying the weight of countless arguments, confessions, and quiet decisions that changed lives forever. That morning, the building smelled faintly of polished wood and old paper. Inside the small courtroom, the atmosphere felt tight enough to snap. Silas Vale sat at a long table beside Carmen Reyes, his posture straight but tense. The dark navy suit he wore felt unfamiliar on him now, like armor borrowed for a fight he never expected to enter. Across the room sat Marina Quinn. Her hair was hastily pulled back, but the anger burning in her eyes was impossible to disguise. Beside her, a sharply dressed attorney leaned close, whispering rapid instructions. Behind them, several curious townspeople filled the wooden benches. News had spread quickly through Briar Glen. The quiet millionaire, the abused child, the public confrontation. Everyone wanted to see what would happen next. Near the back of the room, Ilara Quinn sat beside a court-appointed child advocate clutching the small stuffed fox Carmen had given her the night before. Her thin shoulders remained tense beneath a borrowed sweater, and every few seconds her eyes flickered toward Silas, as if checking whether he was still there. The courtroom door opened. The judge entered. Everyone stood. Once seated again, the proceedings began quickly. "Mr. Vale," the judge said, adjusting her reading glasses as she reviewed the documents in front of her. "You are petitioning for temporary guardianship of Ilara Quinn. Do you understand the responsibilities involved?" "I do, Your Honor," Silas replied calmly. The judge nodded slowly. Then Marina's attorney rose. "Your Honor." The lawyer began, his voice sharp and confident. "This case is not as simple as it appears. My client is a struggling single mother facing hardship. Mr. Vale is a wealthy man with unresolved grief and a public reputation to maintain." He turned toward Silas. "We believe Mr. Vale is projecting the loss of his unborn daughter onto this child. Emotional compensation, not protection." A low murmur rippled through the courtroom. Silas remained still. The attorney continued. "A man with no parenting experience, no relationship with the child prior to this incident, and unlimited financial influence, suddenly inserts himself into a family matter. That raises serious questions about motive." For a moment, even the judge seemed thoughtful. Carmen leaned slightly toward Silas. "This is their strategy," she whispered. "Stay calm." Silas nodded, but across the room Ilara's grip on the stuffed fox tightened. Because in that moment, it felt as if the entire courtroom was quietly deciding whether the one person who had stood up for her might actually lose. The tension in the courtroom deepened as the judge reviewed the case file. For several long moments, the only sound in the room was the soft rustling of paper. Then the judge looked up. Call the first witness. The clerk nodded. Mrs. Evelyn Hart, a quiet woman in her late 50s, rose from the back row and stepped slowly toward the witness stand. Mrs. Hart, the longtime secretary at Briar Glen Elementary School, carried herself with the steady composure of someone who had spent decades caring for children. But today her expression held something heavier. Regret. After swearing in, she adjusted the microphone slightly. I've worked at Briar Glen Elementary for 32 years, she began, and during that time I've learned to recognize when a child is struggling. She glanced briefly toward Alara. This one has been struggling for a long time. The courtroom remained silent. Mrs. Hart continued. Alara Quinn has missed 23 days of school this semester alone, she said. When she does attend, teachers have reported that she often arrives without lunch. She's fallen asleep during class several times due to exhaustion. The attorney for Marina shifted uncomfortably. Mrs. Hart went on. We've documented multiple unexplained bruises over the past year. Wrist injuries, shoulder bruising, once a cut above her eyebrow. The judge leaned forward slightly. Were these incidents reported? Yes, Your Honor, Mrs. Hart replied. But every time authorities followed up, there wasn't enough evidence to move forward. The lawyer rose quickly. Speculation isn't proof. Mrs. Hart nodded calmly. You're right. Then she reached into her folder. But this might help. She handed a sheet of paper to the bailiff. The paper moved slowly down the row of desks until it reached the judge. The room leaned forward collectively. It was a child's drawing. Crayons on thin notebook paper. A tiny girl curled into a corner. Above her towered a jagged red shape holding a bottle high in the air. The judge studied the drawing silently. Mrs. Hart spoke again, her voice softer now. She's drawn versions of this picture 6 different times over the past 4 months. The judge set the paper down slowly. Across the courtroom, Alara stared at the floor. But Mrs. Hart wasn't finished. She turned slightly toward the bench. I wish I could say this town didn't know what was happening to that child, she said quietly. But the truth is, many of us suspected. Her eyes moved briefly across the rows of seated neighbors. The problem wasn't awareness. She paused. It was courage. The courtroom fell into a silence so deep that even Marina Quinn's lawyer had nothing left to say. By the time the judge finished reviewing the evidence, the tension inside the courtroom had shifted. What had begun as uncertainty was slowly becoming clarity. The judge folded her hands together. Before I make a decision regarding temporary guardianship, she said carefully, I would like to ask the child one question. The courtroom stirred slightly. The child advocate leaned toward Alara Quinn. You don't have to answer if you're uncomfortable, she whispered gently. Alara nodded slowly. She rose from the bench, clutching the stuffed fox tightly in her hands, and walked toward the witness stand. Each step looked uncertain, like someone crossing unfamiliar ground. When she reached the chair, she climbed into it carefully. Her small feet didn't reach the floor. The judge's voice softened. Alara, she said kindly, I just want to know one thing. The little girl looked up. Do you feel safe living with your mother? Alara's eyes flickered toward Marina. Her mother stared back with cold fury. For a long moment, the child said nothing. Then she lowered her gaze. A silence stretched through the room. Even the ceiling fans seemed to slow. Finally, Alara spoke. Her voice was barely above a whisper. Home is where you can sleep without being scared. The words drifted through the courtroom like fragile glass. No one moved. No one breathed. The judge studied the child for several seconds before turning back toward the paperwork in front of her. When she finally spoke again, her voice carried the weight of finality. Based on the evidence presented and the immediate safety concerns regarding the child, temporary guardianship of Alara Quinn will be granted to Mr. Silas Vale pending further investigation. For a moment, the room remained frozen. Then Marina exploded. "This is ridiculous," she shouted, jumping to her feet. "You can't take my daughter." Deputy Keller stepped forward immediately. "Ma'am, you need to calm down." "You think you can steal her from me?" Marina screamed toward Silas. "This isn't over." The deputies guided her out of the courtroom. But Alara wasn't watching her. Instead, she was staring at Silas. He approached, slowly kneeling so their eyes were level. Her voice trembled slightly. "Does that mean I don't have to go back?" Silas felt the words settle deep in his chest. He nodded gently. "No," he said. "You're coming home with me." And for the first time since the entire ordeal began, Alara Quinn allowed herself to believe it might be true. The drive from the courthouse to the ridge above Briar Glen was quiet. Autumn sunlight filtered through rows of maple trees, casting long, golden shadows across the winding road. From the passenger seat of Silas Vale's truck, Alara Quinn watched the town slowly disappear behind them. She sat very still. The small stuffed fox Carmen had given her was tucked tightly beneath her arm, as if it were the only thing anchoring her to the seat. Silas didn't rush the silence. For years he had lived comfortably inside quiet moments, and tonight he sensed that silence might be the gentlest thing he could offer her. The farmhouse appeared at the top of the hill a few minutes later. It was an old white house surrounded by tall trees and open fields, its porch wrapped in warm afternoon light. Smoke curled softly from the chimney, and the wide windows reflected the gold and red colors of the late autumn woods. Silas turned off the engine. Alara didn't move right away. Her eyes studied the house carefully, the way someone might examine unfamiliar territory. "It's okay," Silas said softly. "If it feels strange." Alara nodded slightly. Then she stepped out of the truck. Her small shoes crunched against the gravel as she walked slowly toward the front porch. Every movement seemed careful, measured, as if she were afraid that one wrong step might break something fragile. Inside, the farmhouse smelled faintly of cedar wood and warm tea. Silas gave her a simple tour: the kitchen, the living room, the back porch overlooking the valley. He spoke gently, never crowding her space. Finally, he opened the door to a small bedroom at the end of the hallway. Sunlight streamed through pale yellow curtains, illuminating a neatly made bed, a wooden bookshelf, and a small night lamp resting beside the pillow. Alara stood in the doorway. Her fingers tightened slightly around the stuffed fox. "This is for me," she asked quietly. Silas nodded. "If you want it." She stepped inside slowly, her eyes drifting across the room like someone trying to memorize every detail. Her hand brushed the edge of the bed. She sat down carefully. The mattress dipped beneath her weight. For a moment, she simply sat there. Then she whispered something almost too soft to hear. "It's soft." That night, the house grew quiet as darkness settled over the valley. But sleep didn't come easily for Alara. Every small sound startled her. The creak of wooden floorboards, the rustle of wind through the trees, even the distant bark of a neighbor's dog. Hours later, Silas stepped into the hallway to get a glass of water. He found her sitting in the living room chair beside the lamp, wide awake. The stuffed fox pressed tightly against her chest. Her eyes immediately darted toward the front door. "Is it locked?" she asked softly. Silas checked the door and showed her the lock. "It is." Only then did her shoulders lower slightly. For the first time that night, Alara Quinn allowed herself to close her eyes. The first few weeks at the farmhouse were quiet, but quiet did not mean easy. Healing rarely begins with comfort. Sometimes it begins with confusion. Alara Quinn moved through the house cautiously, like someone learning the rules of a new world. She asked permission before touching almost everything. "Can I sit here? Can I have water? Is it okay if I open the fridge?" Each time Silas Vale answered the same way. "You don't need permission for that." At first she didn't believe him. Old habits are hard to unlearn when they were once necessary for survival. One morning, Silas found a small pile of crackers hidden under Ilara's pillow. He didn't scold her. Instead, he placed a basket of snacks on the kitchen counter. "You can take food anytime," he told her gently. "You never have to hide it." Ilara studied the basket for a long time before nodding slowly. Other challenges appeared in quieter ways. If Silas entered a room too quickly, Ilara startled violently. If a cabinet door slammed, she flinched. Once when Silas arrived home 10 minutes later than usual. After a meeting in town, he found her sitting on the front porch steps, hugging her knees tightly. "I thought you weren't coming back," she whispered. The fear in her voice hit him harder than any courtroom accusation. "I told you I would," he said softly, kneeling beside her. "And I keep my promises." Slowly, routine began to form. Breakfast together at the kitchen table. Homework in the afternoons. Short evening walks through the fields behind the farmhouse. At school, Mrs. Hart and the teachers welcomed Ilara carefully, giving her space while gently helping her reconnect with classmates. At home, Silas met regularly with Dr. Nisha Patel, a trauma therapist, who explained the small signals of children who had lived too long in fear. "Safety isn't something she understands yet," Dr. Patel told him, "but she's starting to test it." Silas nodded. He understood. Trust doesn't arrive suddenly. It grows quietly like roots beneath the soil. And sometimes the smallest moment proves that those roots are beginning to hold. One evening near the end of October, Ilara approached Silas in the kitchen holding a folded sheet of paper behind her back. Her eyes looked nervous. "I made something," she said. "Can I put it on the fridge?" Silas smiled gently. "Of course." Ilara unfolded the drawing slowly. The paper crinkled slightly from where she had folded and unfolded it several times, as if she had been debating whether or not to show it. Silas leaned closer. The picture was simple, childlike. But the details carried more meaning than any adult artwork could have. In the center of the page stood a small girl wearing a purple sweater. Next to her was a tall man drawn with broad shoulders and messy brown hair. Behind them stood a white farmhouse beneath a large maple tree, whose leaves burned bright red across the page. Above the scene, written in uneven crayon letters, were 4 words. "My first safe home." Silas stared at the drawing. For a moment he couldn't speak. The kitchen window glowed with the warm light of late afternoon, illuminating the crayon colors in soft gold. Ilara shifted nervously. "If it's not good, I can." "It's perfect," Silas said quietly. The words came out softer than he expected. Ilara blinked. "You like it? I love it." A small smile appeared on her face. It wasn't a big smile, not the loud, carefree grin of a child who had always felt safe, but it was real. Silas carefully attached the drawing to the refrigerator with a magnet. For the rest of the evening, he found himself glancing at it again and again. Not because of the picture itself, but because of what it represented. The word home, for years that word had felt empty to him. A house was simply a structure, a place to exist. But now, watching Ilara sitting at the kitchen table coloring quietly beneath the warm light, he realized something unexpected. Home wasn't the building. It was the people inside it. Later that night, after Ilara had gone to bed, Silas stood alone in the kitchen. The drawing hung softly beneath the refrigerator light. He reached out and straightened the corner of the paper. 10 years earlier, he had believed that losing his family meant he would never have one again. But life he was beginning to understand. Sometimes writes its most meaningful chapters long after we think the story is over. Upstairs, a small light glowed from the hallway outside Ilara's bedroom. And for the first time since she had arrived at the farmhouse, the house slept peacefully. Winter came early to Briar Glen that year. Snow settled across the rooftops and fields surrounding the farmhouse on the ridge covering the valley in quiet white stillness. Months had passed since the courtroom ruling that placed Ilara Quinn temporarily under the guardianship of Silas Vale. But the legal fight was not over. On a gray morning in late January, Silas returned to the courthouse once again. The room felt colder this time, heavier with finality. Across the aisle sat Marina Quinn, thinner than before, her expression hardened with resentment. The evidence against her had grown steadily over the past months. Medical records of untreated injuries, witness statements from neighbors who had finally found the courage to speak, school documentation from teachers who had watched Ilara struggle in silence. One by one, the facts had dismantled the fragile excuses Marina once used. When the judge began reading the decision, the entire room fell quiet. The court finds sufficient evidence of long-term neglect, physical abuse, and child endangerment, she said firmly. Ms. Quinn will be remanded to state custody pending rehabilitation and sentencing. Marina slammed her hand against the table. "This is a lie," she shouted. Deputy Keller stepped forward immediately. The judge did not raise her voice. Order in the court. Across the room, Ilara sat beside Carmen Reyes, her hands folded quietly in her lap. She listened without celebration, without anger, only with a calm stillness that seemed far older than her years. When the hearing ended, Silas walked over to her slowly. "It's finished," he said gently. Ilara looked up. "Does that mean she can't hurt me anymore?" Silas knelt beside her. "No," he said softly, "she can't." The girl nodded. Then she leaned slightly against his arm, not with desperation, but with quiet acceptance. Outside the courthouse, snow continued to fall across the town. For the first time in a long while, Ilara Quinn's future was no longer written in fear. Spring arrived slowly in Briar Glen. Snow melted into streams that ran through the valley fields, and the maple trees began growing new leaves where winter branches had once stood bare. Inside the courthouse once again, the final hearing approached its quiet conclusion. This time the room was calmer, less crowded, but somehow even more important. The judge reviewed the final documents carefully before looking up. "Mr. Vale," she said. "After months of evaluation, home inspections, and testimony, the court finds that you have provided a stable, supportive, and safe environment for Ilara Quinn." Silas remained still, his hands folded carefully on the table. The judge turned to the child sitting nearby. "Ilara," she asked gently, "do you want to continue living with Mr. Vale?" Ilara nodded immediately. "Yes, ma'am. And do you feel safe with him?" "Yes." The judge allowed herself a small smile. "Then the court grants permanent guardianship of Ilara Quinn to Mr. Silas Vale." The words settled quietly across the room, but their meaning carried enormous weight. Outside the courthouse, warm sunlight touched the stone steps as Ilara walked beside Silas. For a few seconds, she said nothing. Then she reached out and gently slipped her hand into his. Not by accident, on purpose. Silas looked down. Ilara hesitated before speaking. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." She looked up, her voice small but steady. "Can I call you Dad now?" The question caught him off guard. For a moment, Silas simply stared at her. Then he knelt down so they were eye level. Emotion thickened his voice. "I would be honored," he said softly. Ilara smiled. And the word family, once broken in both their lives, quietly found its way back. 10 years later, Briar Glen looked almost exactly the same. The same maple trees lined the quiet streets. The same courthouse stood at the center of town, and the same white farmhouse rested peacefully on the ridge above the valley. But one life inside that house had changed completely. On a bright June afternoon, rows of folding chairs filled the courtyard of Briar Glen High School. Families gathered beneath warm sunlight as graduates prepared to receive their diplomas. Among them stood Ilara Vale, now 18 years old. Her dark hair rested neatly beneath a navy graduation cap, and golden honor cords hung proudly across her gown. At the front of the stage, she stepped toward the microphone. As valedictorian, she had one final speech to give. The crowd quieted. Ilara glanced across the audience until she found the person she was looking for. Silas Vale, sitting in the front row. His hair had grown slightly gray over the years, but the quiet strength in his eyes remained unchanged. Ilara smiled softly before beginning. Some children grow up in houses that don't feel like homes, she said. They grow up believing they are mistakes, burdens, people no one will fight for. The audience listened closely, but sometimes, she continued, one person decides not to look away. Her eyes returned to Silas. And that decision can change everything. Silas wiped quietly at his eyes. When the ceremony ended, Ilara ran down the steps and wrapped her arms around him. "We did it, Dad," she whispered. Silas hugged her back tightly. "No," he said gently. "You did." Later that evening, back at the farmhouse, two framed pictures hung side by side on the hallway wall. One showed Ilara in her graduation gown. The other was a simple crayon drawing made years earlier. A girl, a man, a farmhouse beneath a maple tree. And above them, written in uneven letters, "My first safe home." And this time the word home truly meant forever. Did this story move your soul? Share your feelings in the comments and rate it from 1 to 10. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Then tap the bell icon so you never miss a new story. Click the end screen to watch another heartfelt video. See you in the next story.